Hello, I'm Nigel Warburton, and this is a podcast of my book, Philosophy the Classics. You can find out more about this book and others I've written at www.virtualphilosopher.org. And you might like to listen to another podcast I've made with David Edmonds. That's Philosophy Bites, Bites with an I, at www.philosophybites.com. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, The Social Contract. Man was born free, and everywhere he is in chains. This, the opening line of The Social Contract, has stirred the heart of many a revolutionary over the past 200 years. Yet it's balanced in the same book by the disconcerting thought that those who fail to act for the general good of the state should be forced to be free. This sounds like a license for oppression, given the difficulty of ascertaining what is genuinely for the good of the state. Both these ideas convey the uncompromising nature of Rousseau's philosophy. He was never afraid to express controversial and even dangerous thoughts. In an age when the convention was to publish such views anonymously, Rousseau wrote under his own name, and as a result, many of his works were banned, and he lived in perpetual fear of persecution, several times having to flee for safety. In the circumstances, it's not surprising that in later years he became paranoid, believing that he was the victim of an international conspiracy. Rousseau's central aim in The Social Contract is to explain the sources and limits of legitimate authority. He believes that our duties towards the state stem from a social contract, or social pact, as he sometimes calls it, by means of which groups of individuals are transformed into a body politic, a whole which has its own general will, which isn't necessarily simply a sum of the individual wills of the people of which it's composed. The Social Contract. Like most writers in the social contract tradition, including Hobbes and Locke, Rousseau describes the social contract as if it were a historical event. However, he does not mean by this to unravel how actual states were created. Rather, it's simply a device to bring out the underlying structure of the state. He's not saying that there was a moment in history when people actually got together and made a deal with each other, but only that the relations between citizens and state can best be understood by considering the hypothetical origins of the association. The basic agreement made by members of a state is that they shall unite for their common good. There is a great deal to be gained by cooperating as part of a society rather than living alone. Society can provide protection of life and property. So individuals have a strong incentive to collaborate and form a state. At first glance, it might seem that Rousseau entertains two incompatible ideals, since he both praises the freedom that all humans have, even outside society, and emphasises the great benefits of life within society. Our natural freedom is a necessary part of our humanity. If we give up our freedom entirely, or become slaves, then we cease to be fully human. If society were to take away our freedom entirely, then there would be no point in joining it, since in the process we would lose our humanity. Rousseau sets himself the task of explaining how we can form a state without sacrificing freedom. This may seem impossible, since the essence of life in society is that you give up most of your natural freedoms in order to reap the benefits of protection. But Rousseau believes that his particular version of social contract theory does provide a formula that combines genuine freedom with the fruits of society. Central to his account is his doctrine of the general will. The general will. Once individuals have been transformed into a state by means of a social contract, they are united by common goals. The general will is the wish of the state as a whole. The general will pursues the common good. The concept of the general will is probably easier to understand when it's compared with that of the will of all. It may be that all the individuals who together make up the state desire a certain outcome because they stand to gain individually by it. For instance, they might all desire a reduction in taxation. Thus, the will of all the individuals is to lower taxes. However, if the whole state stands to gain by keeping taxes high, then that is the general will, even though the individuals, with their personal interests, do not wish to pursue this policy. For the common good, taxes should be kept high, and anyone who resists this should be forced to be free. Similarly, I might, as an individual, have a vested interest in a new road not being built through my back garden. But if the new route turns out to be the best one for the common good, then as a part of the state, I must will this. Rousseau's philosophy draws a sharp distinction between individuals with their personal interests and desires, which are largely self-serving, and those same individuals as parts of the state. In the latter, public role, there is no scope for dissent from the general will. That would be like turning against your own better self. The self-interested desires that you have as an individual should always be subservient to the higher aims of the general will. The general will is for the common good, and the continued existence of the state depends upon its members setting aside their private interests where they conflict with the state's interests. Freedom. This might seem to leave little room for freedom, at least as the term is generally understood. If you have to sacrifice your personal desires for the greater good of the state, then it seems that your freedom to act will often be limited. We've already seen that Rousseau is happy to advocate forcing people to be free when they refuse to acknowledge the force of the general will. But Rousseau maintains that far from diminishing freedom, this organisation of the state provides it. Acting in accordance with the general will is the most important form of freedom. It is civil freedom, as opposed to the mere desire satisfaction permissible outside society. For him, there is nothing paradoxical about achieving such freedom by means of force. The legislator. The success and longevity of a state depend on the nature of its constitution. Good and appropriate laws are needed for its continued survival. Rousseau suggests that these laws should be created by a legislator. The good legislator is a remarkable individual who brings about a transformation of the people by making a flourishing state possible. Rousseau argues that the legislator's only function should be to write the laws of the state. A legislator who was also a sovereign might be tempted to skew the laws in the direction of his interests, knowing that he would have the power to gain by this. Nor should the legislator draw up an ideal set of laws without taking into account the nature of the people and land for whom he is working. Laws have to be tailored to circumstances. Government. Government should be clearly distinguished from the sovereign. Government's role is purely executive. This means that the government is the group of individuals who put into action the general policies that have been provided by the sovereign. The sovereign is the name Rousseau gives to the state when it is actively pursuing the general will. In less than perfect states, the sovereign may take another form, but in Rousseau's ideal state, it's composed of every citizen. His use of the word sovereign can be quite confusing here, because for us it can simply mean monarch. But Rousseau was thoroughly opposed to the idea that sovereign power should rest with a monarch. One reason why the social contract was considered to be subversive was its defence of the rule by the people, and its open attacks on the idea of a hereditary monarchy. 3 types of government. Rousseau considers 3 possible types of government, though he recognises that most actual states employ a mixture of types. The 3 basic types are democracy, aristocracy, and monarchy. Unlike many political theorists, Rousseau does not prescribe one form of government for every state. A certain flexibility is appropriate, taking into account the circumstances, the size of the state, the nature and customs of the people, and so on. However, he does rank the types of government and clearly prefers an elective aristocracy above the rest. Democracy. Although the governments of the United Kingdom and the United States are often described as democratic, for Rousseau they would more likely be counted as elective aristocracies. By democracy he meant direct democracy, that is, the system by which every citizen is entitled to vote on every issue. Clearly such a system could only work in a very small state, and with relatively simple business to decide. Otherwise, the logistics of getting the whole citizenship together and getting through the business of government would thwart all other activity. Rousseau recognises the attractiveness of such direct democracy when the practical difficulties can be overcome, but points out that so perfect a government is better suited to gods than mortals. Aristocracy. Rousseau recognises 3 types of aristocracy: natural, elective, and hereditary. We usually only use the word to describe the last of these. Hereditary. He thinks hereditary aristocracy the worst kind of aristocracy, and elective the best. Elective aristocracy is government by a group of individuals who have been elected on grounds of their suitability for the job. Elections minimise the risk of those who put private interests before the common good exercising their power for long. Monarchy. Monarchy puts the power of government into the hands of an individual. This system has many inherent dangers. For instance, Rousseau maintains, monarchs tend not to appoint competent officers, but select on the basis of their making a good impression at court, rather than aptitude for the job. The result is bad government. He's particularly scathing about hereditary monarchies, which he says always run the risk of handing over supreme power to children, monsters, or imbeciles, a view that would not have been sympathetically heard by those who believed in the divine right of kings, the idea that inherited monarchy was God's will. Criticisms of the social contract. Freedom. One common criticism of Rousseau's social contract is that it seems to legitimise oppression of an extreme kind, that far from providing the conditions for freedom, it gives totalitarian governments a justification for removing them. This view is lent support not just by the sinister implications of the phrase forced to be free, but also by Rousseau's suggestion that the state should employ a censor whose responsibility it is to enforce morality. The civil freedom that Rousseau celebrates may turn out to be extreme oppression. It certainly needn't include the toleration that the word freedom seems to hint at. Whether this is or is not so will depend on the nature of the general will. This isn't to say that Rousseau was deliberately providing a framework for oppression. His sincere aim was to describe a situation which would provide both freedom and the benefits of society. However, it's a weakness of his system that it could support oppression. How do we discover the general will? Even if we concede that we should sacrifice our individual interests for the sake of the general will, there still remains the problem of discovering what that general will is. Rousseau suggests that if the people voted on any issue without consulting each other, then the majority vote would be in the direction of the general will, minor differences of interests, as it were, cancelling each other out. But this seems implausible. It would at the very least require a fully informed populace. Besides, to expect the people to vote without forming factions is unrealistic. So we are left with the practical problem of deciding what is for the common good. Without a realistic possibility of discovering the common good, Rousseau's entire theory would crumble.